Popular film depictions of medieval warfare often present archers releasing a continuous, almost mechanical stream of arrows as if ammunition were functionally limitless. Generally speaking, this image obscures one of the central logistical constraints of pre-modern warfare. Every missile weapon depended on a fragile chain of production, transport, and battlefield distribution. English longbow armies of the Hundred Years' War are a particularly revealing case. Each archer entered combat with a strictly finite supply, and once that supply was exhausted, tactical doctrine collided with material reality. A minor engagement such as the Battle of Ardres in 1351 already demonstrated how quickly a formation could become operationally vulnerable when its ammunition failed. The question, therefore, is not merely how effectively longbowmen fought, but how English commanders sustained high rates of fire under conditions where replacement arrows had to be manufactured, stored, and physically delivered within a coherent administrative system. The longbow's battlefield reputation rests as much on institutional logistics as on individual skill. At the level of the individual soldier, the English longbow system was defined by strict material limits. A longbowman did not carry an abstract quantity of firepower, but a measurable number of physical objects. Arrows were issued in sheaves, typically bundles of 24, secured at the belt or carried in a bag or case. Surviving administrative records and wardrobe accounts indicate that, generally speaking, most archers entered a major engagement with 2 or 3 sheaves, amounting to roughly 48 to 72 arrows. Even allowing for variation between campaigns, this represented a finite reservoir that could be depleted with surprising speed. The longbow's celebrated tactical role therefore rested on a fragile arithmetic. The number of arrows available at the start of battle set a hard ceiling on sustained fire. The rate at which that ceiling might be reached remains a matter of scholarly debate. According to contemporary historians and modern experimental archaeologists, a competent archer could release 10 arrows per minute under ideal conditions. Some later chroniclers imply even higher figures, but this interpretation remains disputed. The evidence suggests that such maximum rates were rarely maintained for extended periods. Fatigue, battlefield confusion, and the need to select and position arrows would have imposed practical limits. Nevertheless, even a conservative estimate indicates extraordinary consumption. At 10 arrows per minute, a single archer could exhaust a 3-sheaf load in well under 10 minutes of continuous firing. When multiplied across thousands of men, the scale of expenditure becomes immediately apparent. English tactical doctrine emphasized dense volleys at the opening of an engagement, precisely the moment when ammunition stocks would decline most rapidly. A mid-14th century episode illustrates the operational consequences of this constraint. In 1351, during the Anglo-French conflict surrounding Calais, John de Beauchamp led a mixed force of men-at-arms and mounted archers on a raiding expedition. Near Ard, his detachment was intercepted by a larger French formation. Contemporary narrative sources describe the English withdrawing into a defensible position and repelling repeated assaults through concentrated archery. Yet the engagement demonstrates the limits of tactical success when logistical reserves were absent. Once the archers had emptied their sheaves, their role as missile troops effectively ended. Forced into close combat, lightly protected archers could not replicate the defensive power they had exercised at range. The defeat that followed has often been cited by historians as a cautionary example of ammunition failure at the tactical level. It revealed that English battlefield methods were inseparable from continuous material support. This vulnerability was not accidental but structural. By the middle decades of the 14th century, the English crown had increasingly committed itself to a style of warfare centered on massed archery. Campaigns under Edward III demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms formations in which longbowmen disrupted enemy advances and shaped the battlefield before close engagement. Victories such as Crécy in 1346 encouraged the institutionalization of this model. As a result, the Crown's military planning assumed sustained arrow fire as a normal operational requirement. The challenge lay in reconciling that expectation with the realities of production. Arrows were complex composite objects requiring skilled labor, suitable timber, horn for reinforcement, feathers for fletching, and forged metal points. None of these components could be improvised at scale once a campaign was underway. Early royal supply practices began to reflect this tension. Wardrobe and exchequer records from Edward III's reign revealed repeated large-scale requisitions directed at counties and towns. Sheriffs were instructed to gather arrows and bows, often in quantities that strained local economies. According to administrative correspondence, periods of mobilization could temporarily drain regional markets of usable ammunition. The evidence suggests that these emergency measures were reactive rather than systematic. They relied on the Crown's authority to compel delivery, but did not yet constitute a fully centralized supply service. Delays, shortfalls, and uneven quality were persistent concerns. Nevertheless, these practices marked the beginnings of an institutional recognition that archery warfare required organized logistical planning beyond the level of individual captains. Over time, a more stable infrastructure began to emerge. Generally speaking, the repeated demands of the Anglo-French Wars encouraged the growth of what historians sometimes describe as a proto-industrial network. Specialized craftsmen, particularly fletchers and bowyers concentrated in urban centers, became increasingly integrated into royal procurement. Standardized sheaf counts, inspection routines, and storage practices appear with greater frequency in the records of the later 14th century. The Crown sought not merely to purchase finished arrows, but to regulate their quality and dimensions, indicating a move toward uniform military supply. While this system lacked the bureaucratic permanence of later early modern arsenals, it represented a significant step toward institutional logistics. The scale of production implied by major campaigns underscores the gap between tactical doctrine and manufacturing capacity. Estimates by modern scholars, based on surviving accounts, suggest that hundreds of thousands of arrows might be required for a single overseas expedition. Such figures must be treated cautiously, and precise totals remain uncertain, yet even conservative calculations point to extraordinary demand. The Crown's ability to assemble these stocks depended on mobilizing dispersed local industries and coordinating transport to central depots. In this respect, English archery warfare was as much an administrative project as a military one. The longbow's effectiveness on the battlefield presupposed an elaborate background of collection, inspection, storage, and distribution. By the later 14th century, English commanders increasingly operated with an awareness of these structural constraints. Engagements like Ardres were remembered not simply as tactical setbacks, but as logistical lessons. The evolution of supply practices under Edward III and his successors reflects an ongoing attempt to close the gap between the theoretical firepower of massed archers and the practical limits of ammunition. According to contemporary historians, this gradual institutional learning process was essential to sustaining English campaigning on the continent. It laid the groundwork for more systematic preparations in the 15th century, when royal administration would pursue arrow production with unprecedented intensity. In this sense, the material limits faced by individual archers drove a broader transformation in how the English state organized the resources of war. By the early 15th century, English rulers increasingly treated archery supply not as an ad hoc wartime measure, but as a permanent administrative concern. The accession of Henry V in 1413 coincided with a deliberate effort to centralize procurement and impose greater coherence on the Crown's military apparatus. Generally speaking, Henry inherited a logistical framework that had evolved during the previous century, yet he moved to formalize and intensify it. According to contemporary historians, his government recognized that the success of any renewed continental campaign would depend less on isolated feats of arms than on the predictable flow of materiel. In this context, arrows became an object of bureaucratic planning. Royal ordinances restricted the export of weapons and munitions, seeking to conserve domestic stockpiles and prevent leakage to potential enemies. These measures illustrate an emerging conception of military resources as instruments of state policy subject to centralized control. A key institutional innovation was the creation of a specialized office devoted to arrow procurement. In 1413, Henry appointed Nicholas Minot as keeper of the king's arrows, assigning him responsibility for supervising production, purchase, and storage. This office represented a form of bureaucratic specialization that went beyond earlier emergency requisitions. Minot operated within the administrative apparatus of the Tower of London, which functioned as the principal royal arsenal and accounting center. The Tower served not merely as a warehouse, but as a node of inspection, certification, and redistribution. Clerks recorded deliveries, verified quantities, and enforced quality standards. The evidence suggests that the Crown sought to transform a dispersed craft industry into a regulated supply chain, coordinated through a single logistical hub. In effect, the Tower became an early example of a centralized supply depot supporting expeditionary warfare. The Crown's authority extended outward through county-level requisition systems that mobilized local resources. Sheriffs received formal instructions to gather arrows, bows, and component materials from designated communities. These directives relied on established fiscal mechanisms, including taxation and compulsory service obligations. Generally speaking, the system functioned as a negotiated process between royal demand and local capacity. Arrow makers in provincial towns produced standardized sheaves, which were collected, counted, and forwarded along prescribed routes toward major urban centers. There, additional officials inspected consignments before dispatching them to the Tower or to coastal embarkation points. This layered chain of custody illustrates how field logistics were embedded in civil administration. Military supply depended on the routine operation of courts, treasuries, and local governance, rather than on purely martial institutions. The material complexity of arrow manufacture required coordination across multiple supply chains. Suitable timber for shafts had to be sourced from regions capable of providing straight, knot-free wood in large quantities. Goose feathers, essential for fletching, constituted another bottleneck. According to surviving procurement records, the Crown and its contractors competed for access to high-quality feathers, sometimes issuing targeted orders to agricultural districts known for large flocks. Metal arrowheads demanded specialized ironworking, linking military supply to the broader economy of mining and smithing. Each component introduced potential delays. The evidence suggests that bottlenecks in any single sector could slow overall production, forcing the administration to balance competing priorities. In this sense, arrow procurement resembled an early form of industrial coordination, even if it lacked mechanization. Quantitative data from major mobilizations demonstrate the scale at which this apparatus operated. During large campaigns in the later 14th and early 15th centuries, the Crown demanded hundreds of thousands of arrows within compressed timeframes. Administrative correspondence records shipments numbering in the hundreds of thousands, accompanied by tens of thousands of bows. Such figures should be interpreted cautiously, yet they indicate an unprecedented concentration of resources. Peak mobilization often produced acute shortages. Local officials complained that markets were temporarily exhausted and that private purchasers struggled to obtain serviceable ammunition. This interpretation remains disputed in detail, but most historians agree that wartime requisitions could disrupt regional economies. The Crown's ability to absorb available stock underscored both the reach of royal authority and the fragility of the supply system under strain. Transport networks linked this production base to continental theaters of war. Once assembled in central depots, arrows were packed into barrels and crates designed for maritime shipment. Ports such as Southampton and London became logistical gateways through which materiel flowed toward English possessions in France, especially Calais. From these forward bases, supplies were redistributed to field armies. Generally speaking, the process required synchronization between naval transport, port administration, and inland carriage. Delays at any stage threatened operational readiness. Weather, piracy, and harbor congestion could interrupt the movement of cargo, reminding commanders that logistical planning extended beyond simple accumulation of stock. It encompassed the management of routes and timing as much as production. Within the army itself, distribution mechanisms reflected the same administrative logic. Each company of archers traveled with a designated baggage train carrying reserve equipment and ammunition. Wagons functioned as mobile supply depots, positioned to remain accessible yet protected. Field logistics depended heavily on non-combatant personnel who sorted, issued, and tracked supplies. Camp followers, including women and adolescents, performed essential labor in organizing sheaves and relaying them to the firing line. According to contemporary descriptions, this circulation of ammunition required constant oversight. Officers monitored expenditure rates and adjusted resupply accordingly. The battlefield thus reproduced, on a smaller scale, the hierarchical organization of the Crown's administrative system. Procurement, storage, and distribution were continuous processes extending from the village workshop to the front rank. Taken together, these arrangements reveal how the English crown converted a tactical instrument into a manifestation of state capacity. The longbow's effectiveness was inseparable from taxation, regulation, and organized labor. Administrative reform allowed the monarchy to project power across the Channel by sustaining forces in the field for extended periods. The army, in this interpretation, becomes an extension of governance rather than a separate sphere. According to contemporary historians, this integration of military and civil structures was a defining feature of late medieval English warfare. It demonstrates that victory depended not only on battlefield tactics, but on the crown's ability to command resources at a national scale. The arrow, a small and perishable object, thus serves as a lens through which the institutional foundations of English military power become visible. The effectiveness of this administrative machinery ultimately depended on its performance under combat conditions. Preparation alone could not guarantee success unless ammunition circulation functioned at the moment of maximum stress. English archery doctrine assumed that formations would sustain repeated volleys over extended periods, and this assumption required practical mechanisms for force sustainment at the firing line. According to Robert Hardy and other modern authorities, longbowmen were commonly arranged in multiple ranks rather than a single thin line. This structure allowed for rotation discipline. While one rank fired, another could step back, retrieve arrows, or reorganize. Ammunition circulation was therefore built into the geometry of the formation itself. The battlefield arrangement was not merely tactical, but logistical, designed to preserve a continuous output of missiles. When individual archers exhausted their initial sheaves, resupply depended on a carefully managed flow from the baggage train. Contemporary descriptions indicate that wagons were positioned to the rear at a distance calculated to balance safety and accessibility. Camp followers performed an essential intermediary role. Women attached to the army sorted arrows into usable bundles, while boys and other assistants carried them forward in repeated runs. This process resembles a rudimentary conveyor system, maintaining a steady transfer of material from mobile depots to the firing ranks. The evidence suggests that officers monitored expenditure rates and adjusted distribution to prevent localized shortages. In effect, the army reproduced the hierarchical logic of the Crown's broader supply network at the scale of the battlefield. Ammunition was treated as a managed resource rather than a private reserve. Rotation between firing lines reinforced this system. As one archer stepped back to replenish his supply, another advanced to maintain the density of fire. Generally speaking, this cycling reduced the risk that an entire formation would reach exhaustion simultaneously. It also imposed a collective rhythm on combat, subordinating individual action to coordinated procedure. Historians have argued that such practices contributed to the endurance of English archery formations in prolonged engagements. The longbow's reputation for sustained fire was therefore not solely a function of individual stamina, but of institutionalized rotation discipline. Tactical resilience emerged from organization as much as from skill. Even after an engagement ended, logistical thinking continued. Arrows represented a significant investment of labor and materials, and armies attempted to recover what they could. According to surviving accounts, once the field was secure, archers swept the ground to collect spent shafts that remained intact. This interpretation remains partially speculative, since narrative sources rarely dwell on such routine activity, yet administrative records confirm the existence of repair programs in royal arsenals. Recovered arrows were transported back to depots, such as the Tower of London, where craftsmen replaced damaged fletching and repaired nocks. Field maintenance thus extended into a secondary cycle of refurbishment, reducing the burden on fresh production. The battlefield did not mark the end of an arrow's life, but a stage in its logistical circulation. In this convergence of rotation, resupply, and repair, abstract planning encountered operational reality. The English system demonstrated that a medieval army could integrate procurement, distribution, and recovery into a continuous loop. Under battlefield stress, this loop translated into measurable endurance. Formations that might otherwise have fallen silent could maintain their rate of fire. The longbow's tactical impact, therefore, was inseparable from a logistical discipline that functioned in real time. This moment of execution represents the culmination of the Crown's administrative effort, where institutional design manifested directly as combat capability. The practical consequences of this logistical system are most visible in the campaigns of Henry V, where administrative preparation translated into observable operational effectiveness. The 1415 expedition, culminating at Agincourt, offers a particularly clear demonstration. English forces entered the campaign with substantial arrow reserves, assembled through the centralized procurement structures already described. According to contemporary chroniclers, the battlefield was marked by sustained and repeated volleys that disrupted French advances long before close combat developed. While numerical estimates vary, and this interpretation remains disputed in detail, most historians agree that uninterrupted missile fire functioned as a decisive contribution to the English defensive posture. The longbow acted as a force multiplier precisely because its supply was maintained. The contrast with earlier logistical failures is instructive. Episodes such as Ardes revealed how quickly an army could lose tactical coherence once its ammunition collapsed. At Agincourt, by comparison, English archery formations did not fall silent at a critical moment. The evidence suggests that rotation discipline and rear area resupply enabled a continuity of fire that French attackers could not easily neutralize. In this sense, the administrative reforms of the preceding decades were validated under combat conditions. The battle did not simply reward tactical positioning or terrain, it rewarded a system capable of sustaining the material demands of its doctrine. Near contemporary commentary reinforces this interpretation. Chroniclers repeatedly emphasized the density and persistence of English shooting, often describing the air as darkened by arrows. Such language is rhetorical, yet it reflects a perception of overwhelming continuity rather than isolated bursts. Modern historians, approaching these sources with caution, nonetheless see in them an acknowledgement of logistical success. The English army demonstrated that preparation at the level of arsenals and supply depots could manifest directly in battlefield endurance. The aftermath of Agincourt therefore illustrates a central principle of late medieval warfare. Administrative capacity and combat performance were inseparable, and victory depended as much on organized supply as on battlefield maneuver. When viewed over the longer term, the English experience with archery logistics points toward a structural transformation in how late medieval states organized war. The centralized arsenals associated with the Tower of London did not disappear with a single campaign. They became part of an institutional legacy that normalized permanent stockpiling and inspection. Generally speaking, this shift encouraged the standardization of military supply. Arrows, bows, and related equipment were increasingly treated as regulated categories within royal accounting, subject to recurring audits and procurement cycles. The evidence suggests that later 15th century campaigns inherited administrative habits shaped during the Anglo-French Wars. Even as tactical fashions evolved, the expectation that the crown should maintain accessible reserves of materiel remained embedded in governmental practice. This development has broader implications for the relationship between warfare and state formation. Historians often describe late medieval England as moving toward a form of military fiscal state, in which taxation, credit, and administrative specialization supported sustained overseas operations. Arrow procurement illustrates this dynamic at a granular level. The Crown's ability to command resources, coordinate craftsmen, and manage transport networks reflects an expanding bureaucratic reach. Institutional continuity between wartime expedients and peacetime administration blurred the boundary between civil governance and military necessity. In this interpretation, logistical culture became a component of English political identity, reinforcing the notion that effective warfare required predictable systems rather than episodic mobilization. The historiographical significance of this case extends beyond England. Medieval warfare is frequently narrated through battles and commanders, yet the study of logistics reveals a parallel history of organization and material constraint. Some scholars continue to debate the centrality of the longbow itself, arguing that terrain, weather, and enemy decisions were equally decisive at engagements such as Agincourt. This interpretation remains disputed, but even critics acknowledge that missile troops could not exert influence without reliable supply. The arrow, therefore, serves less as a symbol of national exceptionalism than as evidence of administrative adaptation. By widening the lens from weapon to institution, historians gain insight into how European polities experimented with mechanisms of resource management that anticipated later military systems. The long-term consequences of these experiments lie not only in particular victories, but in the gradual integration of warfare into the fabric of governance.